Good morning, and thank you for joining the Robbins House here in this beautiful space at the Umbrella Art Center in Concord, Massachusetts. Normally we hold this program at our home, but this year we have been provided this amazing space thanks to Mike Goodwin, Brian Barata, and Kathy Reagan. The Robbins House is so very thankful to Umbrella for allowing us to use their space, and to Mass Humanities for supporting our endeavors every year to read Frederick Douglass together. The reading of Frederick Douglass is the highlight of our summer programming at the Robbins House. This July 4th, more than ever before, our reading feels vital as we continue to move forward in the fight for civil rights for all. To start us off, Rabbi Michael Rothbaum will say a few words.
Good morning, and I say Shabbat Shalom, a peaceful Sabbath we wish to you from the 280 families of Congregation Beth Elohim in Acton, Massachusetts. It is July 4th, and it is also Shabbat. Shabbat, we are told, according to our tradition, is Zecher L'Tziat Mitzrayim, a remembrance of the Exodus from Egypt. It is a time to remember that though the Israelites were slaves, they were not born for slavery, just like no human being created in God's image is born for slavery. And so we remember, as we take this sacred rest on Shabbat, that all people are entitled to all of the blessings as creations created in God's image. I am wearing a shirt that says, "Resisting tyrants since Pharaoh." The Exodus from Egypt is a remembrance that even though Pharaoh seems really scary and the pyramids seem really big, that there is no earthly power that cannot be overcome. It's our custom on Shabbat morning to read Torah from the first 5 books of the Bible. We have an expansive view of Torah. We call it an Eitz Chaim, a tree of life, a growing tree. And so I am so honored to be reading this great American Torah, this great sacred teaching, this prophetic wisdom from Frederick Douglass, and it is an incredible honor to be here with you today.
Frederick Douglass first appeared on the lecture platform in Concord on October 12, 1841. That day was attended the quarterly meeting of the Middlesex County Anti-Slavery Society. Thundering from the podium, Douglass was fast becoming the most eloquent and probably the most informed anti-slavery speaker in the country. And according to the anti-slavery newspaper published in Boston, The Liberator, an excellent spirit prevailed at this meeting. Discussions later that evening included the subject of prejudice against color and the brutal conduct of the Eastern Railroad assailants, who had forcibly ejected persons of both sexes on account of their complexion, a problem Ellen Garrison would also experience firsthand 25 years later. Douglass again spoke in Concord on at least 2 occasions in 1844, including the August 1st celebration of emancipation in the West Indies, an event at which Ralph Waldo Emerson delivered his first important speech on anti-slavery. A wise man by the name of Joe Zellner said to me a few weeks ago, "There's a difference between independence and being a citizen." When Frederick Douglass read his speech, "What to the Slave is the 4th of July," standing in Rochester's Corinthian Hall, he knew this. And as a man who emancipated himself like our own Cesar Robbins, Frederick knew that suffering of the enslaved and spoke relentlessly about America's great shame. On that day, July 5th, 1852, he was not there to celebrate the Declaration of Independence, and he knew that in this time, while he held everyone's ear, it was once again urgent and necessary to call out the hypocrisy of the Declaration of Independence and America itself. Each year that we read the speech, it seems as though it was written only the day before, as if Frederick knew how important it would be for us to have these words to understand where this country was during his time, and to know how horrific this country's treatment of Black and brown people really was. A little over 100 years later, Fannie Mae Hammer was just as sick and tired of being sick and tired, and today, we still can't breathe. This journey has yet to end, and yet here we are, standing and reading Frederick Douglass's words that express more than a hard look at the brutality of enslavement, the dehumanization that brings, and mentally and physically. Frederick also asks those listening, his fellow humans, to show humanity. And in the end, he leaves us with hope. So while we are staying apart due to COVID-19, we have somehow come together in a way that we've never been capable of before. This movement feels different because this time, there are no excuses for what we do not know and cannot do. Like Frederick asked his peers those many years ago, we stand here and ask you, what is freedom truly? What to a slave is the 4th of July?
Mr. President, friends, fellow citizens, the task before me is one which requires much previous thought and study for its proper performance. The papers and placards say that I am to deliver a 4th of July oration. This certainly sounds large and out of the common way, for it is true that I have often had the privilege to speak in this beautiful hall and to address many who now honor me with their presence. The fact is, ladies and gentlemen, the distance between this platform and the slave plantation from which I escaped is considerable, and the platform and the difficulties to be overcome in getting from the latter to the former are by no means slight. That I am here today is, to me, a matter of astonishment, as well as of gratitude.
This, for the purpose of this celebration, is the 4th of July. It is the birthday of your national independence and of your political freedom. This, to you, is what the Passover was to the emancipated people of God. It carries your minds back to the day and to the act of your great deliverance. This celebration also marks the beginning of another year of your national life and reminds you that the Republic of America is now 76 years old. I am glad, fellow citizen, that your nation is so young. You are, even now, only in the beginning of your national career, still lingering in the period of childhood. I repeat, I am glad this is so. There is hope in the thought, and hope is much needed under the dark clouds which lower above the horizon.
Fellow citizens, the simple story is that 76 years ago, the people of this country were British subjects. The style and title of your sovereign people, in which you now glory, was not then born. You were under the British crown. Your fathers esteemed the English government as the home government, England as the fatherland, although a considerable distance from your home, imposed in the exercise of its parental prerogatives upon its colonial children such restraints, burdens, and limitations as in its mature judgment it deemed wise, right, and proper.
But your fathers, who had not adopted the idea of the infallibility of government and the absolute character of its acts, presumed to differ from the home government in respect to the wisdom and the justice of some of those burdens and restraints. They went so far as to pronounce the measures of government unjust, unreasonable, and oppressive, and altogether such as ought not to be quietly submitted to. I scarcely need to say, fellow citizens, that my opinion of those measures fully accords with that of your fathers. Feeling themselves harshly and unjustly treated by the home government, your fathers, like men of honesty and men of spirit, earnestly sought redress. They petitioned and remonstrated. They did so in a decorous, respectful, and loyal manner. This, however, did not answer the purpose. They saw themselves treated with sovereign indifference, coldness, and scorn.
Oppression makes a wise man mad. Your fathers became restive under this treatment. They felt themselves the victims of grievous wrongings, wholly incurable in their colonial capacity. With brave men, there is always a remedy for oppression. Just here, the idea of a total separation of the colonies from the crown was born. It was a startling idea, much more so than we, at this distance of time, regarded. The timid and the prudent of that day were, of course, shocked and alarmed by it. Their opposition to the then dangerous thought was earnest and powerful, but amid all their terror and affrighted vociferations against it, the alarming and revolutionary idea moved on, and the country with it.
On the 2nd of July, 1776, the Old Continental Congress, to the dismay of the lovers of ease and the worshippers of property, clothed that dreadful idea with all the authority of national sanction. They did so in the form of a resolution. We seldom hit upon resolutions drawn up in our day whose transparency is at all equalate. Resolved, that these united colonies are, and of right, ought to be free and independent states, that they are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown.
Citizens, your father made good that resolution. They succeeded, and today you reap the fruits of their success. The freedom gained is yours, and you, therefore, may properly celebrate this anniversary. The 4th of July is the first great fact in your nation's history, the very ringbolt in the chain of your yet undeveloped destiny.
Fellow citizens, I am not wanting in respect for the fathers of this republic. The signers of the Declaration of Independence were brave men. I cannot contemplate their great deeds with less than admiration. They were statesmen, patriots, and heroes, and for the good they did and the principles they contended for, I will unite with you to honor their memory.
They loved their country better than their own private interests, and all will concede that it is a rare virtue that ought to command respect. He who will intelligently lay down his life for his country is a man whom it is not in human nature to despise. Your fathers staked their lives, their fortunes, their sacred honor on the cause of their country. They were peacemen, but they preferred revolution to peaceful submission to bondage. They were quiet men, but they did not shrink from agitating against oppression. They showed forbearance, but they knew its limits. They believed in order, but not in the order of tyranny. With them, nothing was settled that was not right. With them, justice, liberty, and humanity were final, not slavery and oppression. You may well cherish the memory of such men. They were great in their day and generation. Their solid manhood stands out the more as we contrast it with these degenerate times.
How circumspect, exact, and proportionate were all their movements. How unlike the politicians of an hour. Their statesmanship looked beyond the passing moment and stretched away in strength into the distant future. Fully appreciating the hardship to be encountered, firmly believing in the right of their cause, wisely measuring the terrible odds against them, your fathers, the fathers of this republic, laid the cornerstone of the national superstructure, which has risen and still rises in grandeur around you. Of this fundamental work, this day is the anniversary.
My business, if I have any here today, is with the present. The accepted time with God and his cause is the ever-living now. We have to do with the past only as we can make it useful to the present and to the future. Now is the time, the important time. Your fathers have lived, died, and have done their work, and have done much of it well. You live and must die, and you must do your work. You have no right to enjoy a child's share in the labor of your fathers unless your children are to be blessed by your labors. You have no right to wear out and waste the hard-earned fame of your fathers to cover your indolence.
Fellow citizens, pardon me. Allow me to ask, why am I called upon to speak here today? What have I, or those I represent, to do with your national independence? Are the great principles of political freedom and of natural justice embodied in the Declaration of Independence extended to us? And am I, therefore, called upon to bring our humble offering to the national altar and to confess the benefits and express devout gratitude for the blessings resulting from your independence to us?
Would to God, both for your sakes and ours, that an affirmative answer could be truthfully returned to these questions. Then would my task be light and my burden easy and delightful. But such is not the state of the case. I say it with a sad sense of the disparity between us. I am not included within the pale of this glorious anniversary. Your high independence only reveals the immeasurable distance between us.
The blessings in which you this day rejoice are not enjoyed in common. The rich inheritance of justice, liberty, prosperity, and independence bequeathed by your fathers is shared by you, not by me. The sunlight that brought life and healing to you has brought stripes and death to me. This 4th of July is yours, not mine. You may rejoice, I must mourn. To drag a man in fetters into the grand illuminated temple of liberty and call upon him to join you in joyous anthems were inhuman mockery and sacrilegious irony. Do you mean, citizens, to mock me by asking me to speak today? Fellow citizens, above your national tumultuous joy, I hear the mournful wail of millions whose chains, heavy and grievous yesterday, are today rendered more intolerable by the jubilee shouts that reach them.
My subject then, fellow citizens, is American slavery. I shall see this day from the slave's point of view. Standing here, identified with the American bondman, making his wrongs mine, I did not hesitate to declare with all my soul that the character and conduct of this nation never looked blacker to me than on this 4th of July. Whether we turn to the declarations of the past or the professions of the present, the conduct of the nation seems equally hideous and revolting. America is false to the past, false to the present, and solemnly binds herself to be false to the future.
Standing with God and the crushed and bleeding slave on this occasion, I will, in the name of humanity, which is outraged, in the name of liberty, which is fettered, in the name of the Constitution and the Bible, which are disregarded and trampled upon, dare to call in question and to denounce, with all the emphasis I can command, everything that serves to perpetuate slavery, the great sin and shame of America. I will not equivocate. I will not excuse. I will use the severest language I can command, and yet not one word shall escape me that any man whose judgment is not blinded by prejudice or who is not at heart a slaveholder shall not confess to be right and just.
I fancy I hear some of my audience say, it is just in this circumstance that you and your brother abolitionists fail to make a favorable impression on the public mind. Would you argue more and denounce less? Would you persuade more and rebuke less? Your cause would be much more likely to succeed. But I submit, where all is plain, there is nothing to be argued. What point in the anti-slavery creed would you have me argue?
Must I undertake to prove that a slave is a man? The slaveholders themselves acknowledge it in the enactment of laws for their government. They acknowledge it when they punish disobedience on the part of the slave. There are 72 crimes in the state of Virginia, which, if committed by a black man, subject him to the punishment of death, while only 2 of the same crimes will subject a white man to the like punishment. What is this but the acknowledgement that the slave is a moral, intellectual, and responsible being?
Southern statute books are covered with enactments forbidding, under severe fines and penalties, the teaching of the slave to read or to write. When you can point to any such laws in reference to the beasts of the field, then I may consent to argue the manhood of the slave. When the dogs in your streets, when the fowls of the air, when the cattle on your hills, when the fish of the sea and the reptiles that crawl shall be unable to distinguish the slave from a brute, then I will argue with you that the slave is a man.
For the present, it is enough to affirm the equal manhood of the Negro race.
Is it not astonishing that, while we are plowing, planting, and reaping, using all kinds of mechanical tools, erecting houses, constructing bridges, building ships, working in metals of brass, iron, copper, silver, and gold,
that while we are reading, writing, and ciphering, acting as clerks, merchants, and secretaries, having among us lawyers, doctors, ministers, poets, authors, editors, orators, and teachers,
that while we are engaged in all manner of enterprises common to other men, digging gold in California, capturing the whale in the Pacific, feeding sheep and cattle on the hillside,
living, moving, acting, thinking, planning, living in families as husbands, wives, and children, and above all, confessing and worshiping the Christian's God, and looking hopefully for life and immortality beyond the grave, we are called upon to prove that we are human. Would you have me argue that man is entitled to liberty, that he is the rightful owner of his own body? You have already declared it. Must I argue the wrongfulness of slavery? Is it to be settled by the rules of logic and argumentation as a matter beset with great difficulty, involving a doubtful application of the principle of justice, hard to be understood? How should I look today in the presence of Americans to show that men have a natural right to freedom? To do so would be to make myself ridiculous and to offer an insult to your understanding. There is not a man beneath the canopy of heaven that does not know that slavery is wrong for him.
What? Am I to argue that it is wrong to make men brutes, to rob them of their liberty, to work them without wages, to keep them ignorant of their relations to their fellow men, to beat them with sticks, to flay their flesh with the lash, to load their limbs with irons, to hunt them with dogs, to sell them at auction, to sunder their families, to knock out their teeth, to burn their flesh, to starve them into obedience and submission to their masters? Must I argue that a system thus marked with blood and stained with pollution is wrong? No, I will not. I have better employments for my time and strength than such arguments would imply.
What then remains to be argued? Is it that slavery is not divine, that God did not establish it, that our doctors of divinity are mistaken? There is blasphemy in the thought, that which is inhuman cannot be divine. Who can reason on such a proposition? I cannot. The time for such argument is past.
At a time like this, scorching irony, not convincing argument, is needed. Oh, had I the ability, and could I reach the nation's ear, I would today pour out a fiery stream of biting ridicule, blasting reproach, withering sarcasm, and stern rebuke. For it is not light that is needed, but fire. It is not the gentle shower, but thunder. We need the storm, the whirlwind, and the earthquake. The feeling of the nation must be quickened. The conscience of the nation must be roused. The propriety of the nation must be startled. The hypocrisy of the nation must be exposed. And its crimes against God and man must be proclaimed and denounced.
What, to the American slave, is your 4th of July? I answer, a day that reveals to him more than all other days in the year, the gross injustice and cruelty to which he is the constant victim.
To him, your celebration is a sham, your boasted liberty an unholy license, your national greatness swelling vanity. Your sounds of rejoicing are empty and heartless. Your denunciation of tyrants, brass-fronted impudence. Your shouts of liberty and equality, hollow mockery.
Your prayers and hymns, your sermons and thanksgivings, with all your religious parade and solemnity, are to him mere bombast, fraud, deception, impiety, and hypocrisy. A thin veil to cover up crimes which would disgrace a nation of savages.
There is not a nation on the earth guilty of practices more shocking and bloody than are the people of these United States at this very hour.
Go where you may, search where you will, roam through all the monarchies and despotisms of the old world, search out every abuse.
And when you have found the last, lay your facts by the side of the everyday practices of this nation, and you will say with me that, for revolting barbarity and shameless hypocrisy, America reigns without rival.
Take the American slave trade, which is especially prosperous just now, and carried on in all the large towns and cities in one half of this Confederacy. In several states, this trade is a chief source of wealth. It is called the internal slave trade, in order to divert from it the horror with which the foreign slave trade is contemplated. That trade has long since been denounced by this government as piracy, as an execrable traffic. To arrest it, this nation keeps a squadron at immense cost on the coast of Africa. Everywhere in this country, it is safe to speak of this foreign slave trade as a most inhuman traffic, opposed alike to the laws of God and of man. It is, however, a notable fact that while so much execration is poured out by Americans upon those engaged with foreign slave trade, the men engaged in the slave trade between the states pass without condemnation, and their business is deemed honorable.
Behold the practical operation of this internal slave trade, the American slave trade, sustained by American politics and American religion. Here you will see men and women reared like swine for the market. You know what is a swine drover? I will show you a man drover. They inhabit all our southern states. They perambulate the country and crowd the highways of the nation with droves of human stock. You will see one of these human flesh jobbers, armed with pistol, whip, and bowie knife, driving a company of 100 men, women, and children from the Potomac to the slave market at New Orleans. These wretched people are to be sold singly or in lots to suit purchasers. They are food for the cotton field and the deadly sugar mill.
Mark the sad procession as it moves wearily along, and the inhuman wretch who drives them. Hear his savage yells and his blood-chilling oaths as he hurries on his affrighted captives. There, see the old man with locks thinned and gray. Cast one glance, if you please, upon that young mother, whose shoulders are bare to the scorching sun, her briny tears falling on the brow of the babe in her arms. See, too, that girl of 13 weeping, yes, weeping as she thinks of the mother from whom she has been torn. The drove moves tardily. Heat and sorrow have nearly consumed their strength. Suddenly you hear a quick snap like this discharge of a rifle. The fetters clank and the chain rattles simultaneously. Your ears are saluted with a scream that seems to have torn its way to the center of your soul. The crack you heard was the sound of the slave whip. The scream you heard was from the woman you saw with the babe. Her speed had faltered under the weight of her child and her chains. That gash on her shoulder tells her to move on.
Follow the drove to New Orleans. Attend the auction. See men examined like horses. See the forms of women rudely and brutally exposed to the shocking gaze of American slave buyers. See this drove sold and separated forever. And never forget the deep, sad sobs that arose from the scattered multitude. Tell me, citizens, where under the sun you can witness a spectacle more fiendish and shocking. Yet, this is but a glance at the American slave trade as it exists at this moment in the United States.
Fellow citizens, this murderous traffic is today in active operation in this boasted republic. In the solitude of my spirit, I see clouds of dust raised on the highways of the South. I see the bleeding footsteps. I hear the doleful wail of fettered humanity on the way to the slave markets where the victims are to be sold like horses, sheep, and swine, knocked off to the highest bidder. There I see the tenderest ties ruthlessly broken to gratify the lust, caprice, and rapacity of the buyers and sellers of men.
by an act of the American Congress, not yet 2 years old, slavery has been nationalized in its most horrible and revolting form. Mason and Dixon's line has been obliterated. New York has become as Virginia, and the power to hold, hunt, and sell men, women, and children as slaves remains no longer a mere state institution, but is now an institution of the whole United States.
The power is coextensive with a Star-Spangled Banner and American Christianity. Where these go, may also go the merciless slave hunter. Where these are, man is not sacred. He is a bird for the sportsman's gun. By that most foul and fiendish of all human decrees, the liberty and person of every man are put in peril. Your broad Republican domain is hunting ground for men.
Your lawmakers have commanded all good citizens to engage in this hellish sport. Your president, your secretary of state enforce as a duty you owe to your free and glorious country and to your God that you do this accursed thing. Not fewer than 40 Americans have within the past 2 years been hunted down and without a moment's warning hurried away in chains and consigned to slavery and excruciating torture. Some of these have had wives and children dependent on them for bread. But of this no account was made. The right of the hunter to his prey stands superior to the right of marriage and to all rights in this republic, the rights of God included.
For black men, there are neither law nor justice, humanity nor religion. The Fugitive Slave Law makes mercy to them a crime and bribes the judge who tries them. An American judge gets $10 for every victim he consigns to slavery, and $5 when he fails to do so. The oath of any two villains is sufficient, under the hell black enactment, to send the most pious and exemplary black man into the remorseless jaws of slavery. His own testimony is nothing. He can bring no witnesses for himself. The minister of American justice is bound by the law to hear but one side, and that side is the side of the oppressor. Let this damning fact be perpetually told. Let it be thundered around the world that in tyrant-killing, king-hating, people-loving, democratic, Christian America, the seats of justice are filled with judges who hold their offices under an open and palpable bribe and are bound in deciding the case of a man's liberty to hear only his accusers.
In glaring violation of justice, in shameless disregard of the forms of administering law, in cunning arrangement to entrap the defenseless, and in diabolical intent, this fugitive slave law stands alone in the annals of tyrannical legislation.
Americans, your Republican politics, not less than your Republican religion, are flagrantly inconsistent. You boast of your love of liberty, your superior civilization, and your pure Christianity, while the whole political power of the nation is solemnly pledged to support and perpetuate the enslavement of 3 million of your countrymen. You hurl your anathemas of the crowned-headed tyrants of Russia and Austria, and pride yourselves on your democratic institutions, while you yourselves consent to the mere tools and bodyguards of the tyrants of Virginia and Carolina. You invite to your shores fugitives of oppression from abroad, honor them with banquets, Greet them with ovations, cheer them, toast them, salute them, protect them, and pour out your money to them like water. But the fugitives from your own land, you advertise, hunt, arrest, shoot, and kill.
You discourse eloquently on the dignity of labor, yet you sustain a system which, in its very essence, casts a stigma upon labor. You can bare your bosom to the storm of British artillery to throw off a 3-penny tax on tea, and yet wring the last hard-earned farthing from the grasp of the black laborers in your country. You profess to believe that of one blood God made all nations of men to dwell on the face of the earth, and hath commanded all men everywhere to love one another. Yet you notoriously hate and glory in your hatred all men whose skins are not colored like your own.
You declare before the world, and are understood by the world to declare, that you hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, and that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And yet, you hold securely in a bondage which, according to your own Thomas Jefferson, is worse than the ages of that which your fathers rose in rebellion to oppose, a 7th part of the inhabitants of your country.
Fellow citizens, I will not enlarge further on your national inconsistencies. The existence of slavery in this country brands your republicanism as a sham, your humanity as a base pretense, and your Christianity as a lie. It destroys your moral power abroad, it corrupts your politicians at home, it saps the foundation of religion. It makes your name a hissing and a byword to a mocking earth. Be warned. A horrible reptile is coiled up in your nation's bosom. The venomous creature is nursing at the tender breast of your youthful republic. For the love of God, tear away and fling from you the hideous monster. Let the weight of 20 millions crush and destroy it forever.
Allow me to say, in conclusion, notwithstanding the dark picture I have this day presented of the state of the nation, I do not despair of this country. There are forces in operation which must inevitably work the downfall of slavery. I, therefore, leave off where I began, with hope. While drawing encouragement from the Declaration of Independence, the great principles it contains, and the genius of American institutions, my spirit is cheered by the obvious tendencies of the age. Nations do not now stand in the same relation to each other that they did ages ago. No nation can now shut itself up from the surrounding world and trot round in the same old path of its fathers without interference.
The time was when such could be done, but a change has now come over the affairs of mankind. Walled cities and empires have become unfashionable. The arm of commerce has borne away the gates of the strong city. Intelligence is penetrating the darkest corners of the globe. Wind, steam, and lightning are its chartered agents. Oceans no longer divide, but link nations together. From Boston to London is now a holiday excursion. Space is comparatively annihilated. Thoughts expressed on one side of the Atlantic are distinctly heard on the other. In the fervent aspirations of William Lloyd Garrison, I say, and let every heart join in saying it, all God speed the day when human blood shall cease to flow, in every clime be understood the claims of human brotherhood, and each return for evil good, not blow for blow, when all feuds to end, and change into a faithful friend, each foe.
Thank you to our readers for their lovely effort and beautiful words that they shared with us from Frederick Douglass. We ask for those who are streaming online to please stay with us as we set up for our panel discussion about the civil rights movement through the eras of the past and today. And again, thank you for coming and joining us virtually. Welcome back. Hope everyone had a few moments to grab a drink of water and go to the bathroom. Before we start with our panel discussion, I'd like to introduce Edelyn, who's going to read a poem by Jericho Brown.
Bullet points. I will not shoot myself in the head, and I will not shoot myself in the back, and I will not hang myself with a trash bag. And if I do, I promise you, I will not do it in a police car while handcuffed, or in a jail cell of a town I only know the name of because I have to drive through it to get home. Yes, I may be at risk, but I promise you, I trust the maggots who live beneath the floorboards of my house to do what they must to any carcass, more than I trust an officer of the law of the land to shut my eyes like a man of God might, or to cover me with a sheet so clean my mother could have used it to tuck me in. When I kill me, I will do it in the same way most Americans do, I promise you. Cigarette smoke, or a piece of meat on which I choke, or so broke I freeze in one of those winters we keep calling worst. I promise if you hear of me dead anywhere near a cop, then that cop killed me. He took me from us and left my body, which is, no matter what we have been taught, greater than the settlement a city can pay a mother to stop crying, and more beautiful than the new bullet fished from the folds of my brain.
Thank you. We have an amazing array of human beings who are about to have a nice fun conversation about the civil rights movement from the past to currently where we are right now. So I'm going to actually introduce David.
Hello everyone, my name is David Lincoln. I'm on the board here at the Robbins House. I also teach history down in Fairfield, Connecticut at Sacred Heart University, and in Norwalk, Connecticut at Norwalk Community College. So it's a great honor to be here with you today. And we want to have a panel discussion with some of our honored guests and participants here about the deeper message of Frederick Douglass's speech, and the idea in particular of historical interpretation, historical memory, and how in a large, proud society you will often see a struggle between different viewpoints about what history means and what historical events mean. So I'd like to invite my panelists up here now. We have Maria Madison, the co-president of the Robbins House. We have Michael Goodwin. We have Roland Gibson, and we have Elaine Rabb. So I was wondering, everybody, if you'd join me and perhaps give your thoughts on these ideas up here in the panel.
We'd be happy to.
Thank you, Michael.
Do we need one more mic?
I think we need one more for Roland, maybe. We can also pass him one.
Yeah.
I'll grab one for Roland. Go. Right here. Catch it up.
Great. So, shall I start with you, Maria? What your thoughts are? No? How about you, Roland?
Would you restate the question?
Just wondering what your impressions of that great speech are and what your thoughts are on this idea of historical memory and the struggle over it, and even thinking about some of the things that are going on today with these issues over statues and public places and monuments.
Thank you. That's an important question. I've come to understand, based on my own experience, that what I learned in elementary and high school was one narrative of American history. And I would submit that what I've come to understand, there's more than one narrative. And today's reading demonstrates the narrative that has been omitted from most history classes. Fast forward, how does that impact today? Most people have relied on, only because they've been taught, one narrative of American history. This country is great. Lamentably, very few people have learned other narratives, whether the narrative relates to the African American, Native American, and other groups who were excluded from the founding ideology. We the people. There were numbers of groups that were excluded, including slaves. And that dynamic continues to be played out today. And it is my hope that this country will come to grips with that issue and resolve it favorably.
Thank you so much, Roland. Elaine, I was wondering if I could have your thoughts on the issue.
Well, as an educator, I was just thinking when Roland was talking about how I grew up in the 70s and 80s, and I was taught from one perspective, the narrative of that. And because of that, going through teacher education, I was still taught that. So I still espouse that being part of my career until I decided to start to do my own scholarship, to do a lot more, dive deeper into the realities of not just the history of America, but just the questioning things consistently, and not just taking what people are telling me as truth value or face value. And that's what I want to impart to my students, and that's what I see is happening now with educators, with this movement that's happening, that people are really delving deeper into the whys. Whose voices are not heard? Why are these voices not being represented? Who do we not see, and who do we see, and why is that? just a constant questioning, and the self-reflection of what can I do to learn to make it better for myself and for my family and for my community.
Thank you, Elaine. Michael, any thoughts?
Yeah, thank you very much. So first, I mean, the speech that we just had the privilege and honor of reading, it's just such a powerful piece of literature. And I was joking with Maria that I had to stop myself from just, go, you get them, amen. You know, I mean, there's so many powerful messages in there. And, you know, and what's sad about it is how relevant it is. You know, and although we might not be dealing with systemic slavery, we're dealing with systemic racism. And so there are so many messages in that speech that ring just as true today. And so, of course, then what we're starting to talk about here is what can we do so that in 50 years, if we read this speech, hopefully it won't seem so relevant, right? Hopefully it'll seem like, wow, that was what a thing we went through. But thank God that's not what we have to say about our country right now. You know, one of my favorite authors, her name is Maria Popova. She's this really expansive thinker, and she just wrote this book called Figuring. And this book is actually all about the contributions of women, largely gay women, in the sciences and the arts in the 19th century. And she's done this work of, as Maya Lin once said, the famous sculptor who did the Vietnam Memorial in DC, she said that her work was all about making the invisible visible. Right? And so Maria Popova in this book is doing the same thing with these women, and in it she says, history is what survives the shipwreck of chance and judgment. So the history that comes to us that Elaine and Roland were speaking about, that we're taught in our schools, that's what has survived, and not by accident alone. And that's what's gotten there. So it's our job to make the invisible visible, to learn these stories that we don't know, that we are not told, that are a critical part of our stories, of the story of our country. Can you imagine, right, if 30, 40 years from now, we looked back on the speech last night that Trump gave at Rushmore and said, oh, that is the story of America in 2020. So we need to do such a better job of looking for that holistic, rounded view of what's actually happening. And there's no way to do that without bringing the voices of all peoples.
Thank you, Michael. I'm struggling with, the personal and the political and the public. In my body, I'm shaking. Each time I hear that speech or I hear the Declaration of Independence read, I'm shaking and quaking in my own soul because of how present it is. And so many individuals, particularly the protesters, and even in the Concord protest, and hundreds of people turning out in front of the Robbins House to support the concept of Black Lives Matter. That's inspiring, but to recognize that it's 2020 and that we still have at least 30% of our population thinking that it's okay to not dig deeper and understand history and its contemporary social justice implications. I'll give one example. I believe in the inflection point. I believe in the protests. But when I watch Mount Rushmore, all I can think of is the sculptor was a Klansman. All I can think of is he wasn't just a Klansman, he was one of the 6 leaders of the Klan at the time. Everywhere I look, the more you dig, the more you try to unearth that wonderful history, the more we see how steeped in hateful racism or discrimination against BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, people of color in this country. The more we dig and unearth, the more we see how the country is built from keeping power and privilege in the hands of those who have benefited from it, such that now the inequity gap is growing exponentially. What does that mean? That means that we've got Blacks who are dying more from COVID-19 It means that economically, we are decreasingly able to feed our families. It means we are being incarcerated at greater rates. It means that a gap that we should be closing is growing, particularly because we have the kinds of crises that we're seeing now, that we are disproportionately represented as gig workers. We're disproportionately represented in those who are exposed to COVID-19. We are disproportionately represented as those who live in congregative living situations. So are we at an inflection point? I would say we are, because we're working with constituents like Mike's Rivers and Revolutions, teaching students these things. We are because we're partnering with Rabbi Michael, who was here speaking earlier. We are because we're partnering with absolutely wonderful community activists who are going out on the front lines, putting their lives on the line, knowing that history has taught us that protesters can be called rioters, and as rioters, they can have dogs unleashed on them. Using the word rioters means they could be thrown in jail and not have the money to put up bail, right? So if we call them rioters, and we let people call them rioters, it's triply harmful. And that we have subsequent generations of individuals with more of a daunting future than what we're seeing even today. So it's hard to listen to Douglass's speech, but it's equally inspirational. It's an excellent reminder of some of the words that Ellen Garrison said, that, I need to test my rights. For respectable people, as respectable people, do we have rights that ought to be respected? So our very own Concord resident, Ellen Garrison, said that, born and raised in Concord, 1823, leaving in 1840. I think she said that when she was 40, though, in the 1860s. She was testing whether respectable people ought to have rights that ought to be respected. It's pretty simple, pretty basic, and we're still out here fighting for it. But the we, that's the exciting part.
Hopefully she's the kind of person that we can elevate in terms of her profile with our work at the Robbins House to get more of these stories shared historically. So I was also wondering, this has come up in a few of your points, Elaine, you talking about needing to dig deeper, Roland, you talking about only one narrative being taught, the idea of propping up a certain narrative of near white supremacy. And I was wondering if I could have any of your thoughts on this issue throughout history of the wage of whiteness, something used as a wedge between white people and people of color to exacerbate divisions in our nation. Wondering if any of you had any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I'll jump in.
Thanks, Michael.
Yeah, so it's a very complicated question you're asking, and the first thought that came to mind, look, we're still living in a very segregated society, and part of our challenge now in moving ahead is to create real, meaningful dialogue across lines of difference, and that needs to be happening in a much more robust way. I'm reminded of a novel written called All Quiet on the Western Front. It's a novel written about World War I. And there's this scene where a French soldier and a German soldier fall into a trench in no man's land. And they fall down and it's dark and they start grappling. And one of the soldiers, he takes out a knife, the French soldier, and he digs in and he kills the other guy. As soon as he finishes killing him and he watches the life expire from his eyes, all of a sudden he says, "Oh my God, what have I done? Now that I'm actually face to face with you, I realize that you're a man just like I am." He takes out, it's scorching, he takes out the guy's wallet and sees a picture of his family. And all of a sudden he says, oh my God, I was trained to see you as an abstraction. I was trained to see you as something different, as something else. And now that you're here, and now that you're in front of me, and now that you are dead, I realize that we are brothers. I wish I had not done that, brother. And so it's that direct contact which is still so sorely missing. And creating spaces, such as this one here, where people of different backgrounds and different socioeconomic backgrounds, different races, different ethnicities, can come together and engage in real dialogue. And obviously, look, that's hard work, right? And we get afraid to do that work sometimes because we're afraid of saying the wrong thing, particularly when it comes to race. But in my experience, and I've spent a lot of my life as someone who has very much benefited from white privilege, I have worked hard to really try to understand what that means for me, what other people's experiences have been like, and in that process have come to just develop, so much more empathy for everybody's experience and how to use, what what I have had the fortune to experience in the service of others, which I feel is an obligation. So the short of it for me is it's about those direct. We have to have that direct contact. I don't want to see it in a trench like that, but I do want to see it face to face like that.
Can I add to that? So I used to preach contact. I mean, literally. And I preached contact even more after I read some studies by this woman I always talk about, her, Patricia Devine, and her interventions, how to get rid of bias, how to get rid of discrimination. And a part of the secret sauce is perspective taking and counter-stereotypic, replacing stereotypes, etc. And contact was key to that. However, contact is only going to work if those who have traditionally been in historical positions of privilege and power, which historically has been white populations, begin to confront what their philosophies, beliefs, deep-rooted biases are. Because what we're seeing is contact, even in sometimes of the most well-intentioned, is killing Black people. And I say that because of, and I always say my husband's gonna murder me, but epigenetics, right? There's this wonderful work by this woman, Geronimus, and so many others, that contact, even in the most best of intentions, still allows for either a patronizing or a microaggression or a microinvalidation that hits in our bodies physiologically, such that adds to, a degradation of us, not a genetic change, but a genetic alteration that causes us to have the worst health outcomes. So, I think more people have to do some of the work you're doing, which is training kids as early as possible to try to understand those hidden stories, to understand why our cultures are treated so differently historically, to help white students in particular recognize their humanity vis-a-vis others. But when that hard work doesn't happen, those interactions actually are impacting people physiologically, emotionally, such that, for example, the debate's always out there, I'm sure, on whether Metco is a good thing or a bad thing. I mean, my parents, sending me to all-white schools had the best of intentions, and academically that paid off. But physiologically, the odds are, just looking at the statistics of it, I will live 20 years less than you will live. So it's not just the contact, but I think we have to really preach early education.
Well,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Thanks.
Over the last few years, I've begun to reflect on American history in this country as a case study. In 1776, an experiment was created and the ideals were lofty. But as a case study, the concept excluded a significant number of people. And from the beginning, the experiment was flawed. It was badly flawed. And my understanding of American history from the beginning, through the Civil War, through 1896 with Plessy versus Ferguson, the system, the mores, the values, the American system was an exclusive system. One group had benefits and privileges. Now we use the language, one group was superior to the other group, or other groups, plural, Native people, women, and so on. And as a case study, we still haven't figured out, as a country, how to reconcile and deal with the flaws in the system. And I respectfully submit we came close. Those of us who lived through the Civil Rights Movement in the 60s, the Kerner Commission report, I think President Johnson did a wonderful thing by asking a group of people to figure out what went wrong, what happened, why it happened, and how to prevent it. Some of you in the room may remember the Kerner Commission. So as a case study, there was a group of 21 people who looked at those wonderful questions. What happened? Why did it happen? What can we do to prevent it? We came close to, they offered remedy, and we came close as a country to creating remedy. But those of you who know the story, President Johnson and his cabinet were not open to the findings, and they were not open to remedy. And here we are, roughly 50 years later, going through another upheaval, seeking remedy to flaws from the beginning. And the question remains, is this country going to be able to resolve that conflict?
David, can I ask you a question?
Sure.
I always think that we've tried these experiments before, and we always end up failing. And you are one of those individuals who describe the Reconstruction era best. So, or at least on our board. So I just wonder, do you see anything different in this inflection point, or more hope, or could this be a parallel to the demise of the Reconstruction era?
Oh, I hope not. So far, and I think it is really, really early, but so far, what I see when I look at the newsreel footage, when I go to some protests in Boston, in Concord, I see a lot more white participation, sustained white participation. I see opinion polls showing that more white people, it looks like so far, knock on wood, a majority are starting to believe that systemic racism, the wage of whiteness, that they are real things and that they need to be addressed, and that those who say they aren't real cannot necessarily be trusted. And with Reconstruction, what I see is that as the years passed, there was initial white enthusiasm. You see a lot of white missionaries and teachers coming down to the South, enduring insults, sometimes physical threats. You see a lot of passion in Washington among the Republican Party, but it started to wear out as the country started to get battered by other crises, especially the Great Depression of the 1870s. And so my hope is that that this enthusiasm that we see right now can carry forward, and so far it looks more promising, but we have another depression looming. I worry about that because of COVID-19, and we see these surges all over the country. We see leadership not taking it seriously, going back to the event at Mount Rushmore last night. Also amidst the backdrop of sacred land stolen by force from the Lakota and the Northern Cheyenne. So the whole issue, that seems to be the minority at this point. But I worry that sometimes as the economy turns south, as life gets hard, white people lose their focus on the issues of racism and systemic inequality. And I just really hope that does not happen. Now, I'm hopeful, I really am, looking at some of the things that I've been seeing, but that's a big worry for me. The idea, and economic depression is just, it's a killer. It divides people. It makes people more inclined to look at people as another. It's like the one of the 1870s really helped take the steam out of Reconstruction. The one in the 1930s produced the Nazis, produced Hitler, helped lead to World War II. They got, 2.6% of the vote, the Nazis in Germany in the parliamentary elections of 1928. So that would be my biggest worry, but I am hopeful. I really am. Reading the news, looking at the news, hearing from people, seeing the gatherings, seeing how many white people are up and involved and seem passionate about it. And I mean, maybe it took these horrible things and this horrible leadership to make that happen, but maybe if some good can come out of it, that'll be it. So I'm hopeful.
Thank you. Thank you. You brought us low and then you brought us high.
Yeah, when you all were talking, I was thinking, like you just mentioned, that it's good to see young white people, white American citizens coming out for this cause, and finally seeing and wanting to educate themselves, reading all the books, watching the webinars, listening to Dr. Kennedy speak about anti-racism and how to be an anti-racist. It's great, the communication, having that there, that's wonderful, but then what are you going to do? Are you going to do this and then go back to your segregated community? Mm-hmm. Are you going to continue to, you speak the speak and talk the talk, but how can you walk that walk? Mm-hmm. That's my concern. The younger students, younger kids now, the younger generation, I believe that they're getting it. I really do. Yeah, I'm hopeful, really, really hopeful, because what I see, like you said on television, you see things on television, they're younger, and they're out there, and they're protesting with black and brown, the Latinx, and African Americans, and all different ethnicities there. But the older generation are the ones who hold the purse strings. Mm-hmm. What are we doing? How are we going to make change? Mm-hmm. I'm hopeful that this dialogue will continue, but you got to move beyond dialogue. Mm-hmm. What are you willing to give up? What are you willing to lean into, that discomfort or that fearfulness, and address that and be able to step across that boundary and put yourself out there? Mm-hmm. Because African Americans have been dealing with this in this country, for centuries. We understand the discrimination. We see the racism. We see the bias. We see the microaggressions. And we've been calling it out for centuries. Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, like you said, it finally took these incidents that were filmed for people to actually say, wow, this really happens.
Yeah, 8 minutes, 46 seconds, and then numerous hours accumulated over time. I want to answer your question with a request from the whole audience, which I think Nikki put in the announcement for this event, which is vote, right? And I think there are 3 bills, is that right? In our 4, 3? Yeah. So voting is one way, I hope, to make an instrumental change to our times.
Yeah, and I guess so many wonderful comments from you all. And I think my hopefulness stems from, sort of Elaine, as you were just saying, that there does seem to be amongst the younger folks a real, not just excitement, but a real sense of necessity of getting involved. And oftentimes when I work with students, a common, thing I'll hear is, it's just so overwhelming. What do I do? I'm one person. I'm like, here in Concord, I'm this one white kid in Concord. How am I going to get involved with systemic racism? And what I'll often offer is, look, maybe the first step is learn the story in your own community, right? Learn the story right here where you live, and then act right here where you live. And that's how you develop the skills and the capacities to do the larger work. And to me, it has to go in that direction. You don't start by saying, I'm going to go and fix the whole thing. You have to develop those skills here, and I think that schools need to be playing a much bigger role in helping students develop those skills and capacities to work towards social justice. I also feel that, there's this massive cultural mindset shift that needs to happen, and this is probably the hardest thing of all, which is this South African idea of Ubuntu. And Desmond Tutu describes Ubuntu as, I am because you are. Right? There's no such thing as a solitary individual. And how you're doing affects how I'm doing. And actually the word dehumanize was used in the speech this morning by Frederick Douglass. And Tutu says, when you dehumanize someone else, whether you like it or not, you yourself are dehumanized. And that is the truth. I believe that is probably the most basic truth of our existence, that everything is connected to everything else. Right? It's the most basic principle of the natural world, right? And how our environment works, right? And it's the most basic principle of how humanity works. That if one person is suffering, then I'm suffering too. That is so antithetical at this point to our individualistic, competitive society. And that shift needs to happen. And for me, my intervention is in schools and trying to help schools move away from competition to collaboration. Help schools move away from you're there for your individual achievement to no, you're there to be a part of a learning community. And it has to start happening there. We have to start doing that work there.
I'm just going to add, thank you, because we get 7,000 to 8,000 visitors every summer at the Robbins House, except for during the COVID era. We're closed. We get 7,000 to 8,000 visitors every summer at the Robbins House, and we do a visitor evaluation, and 80 to 90% of our visitors answer that they learned so much about Black history, that they didn't learn it in school. And I'm including in that, physics professors from the University of Pennsylvania. I'm including in that, politicians from across the country. I'm including in that people who went to elite K through 12 schools who said they never learned Black history. They never heard or understood Reconstruction. You work in a school, I'm sure you've seen this. So that's where the change has to happen, is trying to teach a balanced and deep, accurate explanation for why slavery happened, but go beyond slavery. What happened when the slaves went free? And go beyond the word slavery and talk about the inventions. Go beyond, and say that Africans who were brought to America actually taught those early whites how to farm, right? Rice, cultivating rice. And contributing ingenious inventions of which we're benefiting from right now. So I also recommend go and look up African American inventors, or even look up the work of Lisa Cook, who discovered that one of the reasons there's an economic divide is because the patents of Africans or descendants of Africans were stolen, disregarded, or then not even allowed to get patents for those inventions. So our contributions aren't just in our exceptional labor to create some of the monuments and buildings that, in cities like DC, but also in the sciences, in technology, in the arts, in the music. What is American culture and what is exported around the world is infused by BIPOC, Black, Indigenous people of color. And for whatever reason, the fear to acknowledge that has to be disbanded. And here, and my last word will be, I think it was, oh gosh, Bob Marley got it from whom, Steve? Bob Marley got it from Haile Selassie. Yeah, until the philosophy that holds one man superior and another inferior is finally and permanently abandoned, there's a war.
You're a treasure, Maria. So I just want to say that.
This room is full of treasures, and a huge treasure is Nikki.
Yeah, Nikki!
Thank you guys so very much. Yeah, I was thinking and like snapping back here, nodding my head. It was like, oh my gosh, yes, everything you were saying, exactly. So thank you very much to our panelists for taking the time to discuss some fun, not fun, uplifting, hopeful moments of our history and our past and looking towards the future. As we close today, if you missed any part of our reading or panel discussion, we invite you to take a look at our YouTube video in the next two weeks. We have been graciously gifted a recording of both parts, so those will be available to you later on next week. And you can also watch the semi-live feed still on our Facebook page, so feel free to share that as well. We also invite you to take a moment today, head on over to the Mass Humanities website and record your favorite part of Frederick Douglass's speech, whether it's a full section, the full speech itself, and send it to us at the Robbins House so we can share it with our community. But other than that, please be safe, take care of each other, and have a really reflective July 4th, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Nikki.